sons. If you think that white men in Mississippi weren't upset about that, you got another thing coming. So there's a powerful dynamic going on here. So at a number of levels, and that's what that's one of those are some of the lessons that I learned as a co-project director. I was supposed to be running the project, but I found out these brothers were protecting us, and then the majority of the work that was being done in preparation for almost anything that we engaged in was done by middle-aged black women. That's the most powerful tool. That's the axis of power internally, so far as my own personal recollections are concerned.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that axis remains. I don't live that much in the United States. I work in Vietnam. My family and I engaged in building hospital for Agent Orange victims in Vietnam. But my local work here is right now with the Cooperative Center Federal Credit Union. I'm chair of the board. But the work that's being done around there's a group called the Humanitarian Committee for Jamil Al-Amin, H. Rap Brown. Some of you heard of it. This is the guy who really popularized the slogan Black Power in the 1960s. His visibility has been noticeably tamped down, and he spent almost half his life in prison. He was in Supermax in Colorado, Supermax. Supermax prison, Pelican Bay is a Supermax prison. It's a place where you go where there's sensory deprivation every day. Where if you go in to take a shower and the guard, you're in total isolation for 23 and a half hours per day. When you come out, if a guard has had to do overtime and he really needs to be with his family, he might slap you upside the head with his club. But that's normal behavior. Waterboarding is a normal kind of activity. That is lying you on your back and strapping you down and pouring water in your face. So that's what I mean. We moved this brother from, the five of us, 4 women from SNCC and myself. Everybody's nearly 70 years old. We were asked to aid in some way with this brother. We managed to do something that was almost, it's a victory for the movement. We got this brother moved from Supermax in Colorado to a medical facility in North Carolina.
Right on.
This brother has given his life to the struggle. He's suffering from cancer. That's what I mean by that kind of energy. That same energy of organizing, of learning and spending the rest of your life learning how to organize and focusing on making examples for the people is a lesson I learned from black women in Mississippi and from black men who were carrying guns to protect my life when I was in Mississippi.
Right on.
Yeah, I want to just add one little short piece to what Jimmy just said around the whole question about the men with the guns. I think there is one of my lessons, because we talk a lot about violence or armed struggle versus nonviolence. It's a big debate. It's been, anybody who was around Occupy Oakland out here more recently knows that debate. And what I think Jimmy just talked about basically was the dialect, what I would call, fancy word here, the dialectic between armed struggle and nonviolence. Nonviolence was only possible in the South and places like Mississippi because there was people behind who were prepared to protect with armed guns. People who were in Louisiana, the Deacons for Defense, Robert Williams, even when I was in Cambridge, Maryland, this was with Gloria Richardson, who led the Cambridge Nonviolent Action Committee. You have the same dynamic. We could basically be nonviolent in the streets, parade, march, and so on, because we knew to a great degree we were protected. Because there was another group who was not formally organized in the sense that one thinks about it in terms of classical organization theory, but who were prepared to do something to people who attacked us or oppressed us. And so, to me, they go together. And so you can't have one without the other. And particularly in a place like Mississippi, there is no safety in being totally nonviolent. You get eaten up, or as one of these speakers, title from a new book out by Charlie Cobb says, this nonviolent stuff will get you killed. And if you don't, basically have some way of protecting yourself.
So just to kind of intervene on something that it also has contemporary relevance, I think this issue that you were speaking about earlier about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the experience of that, would you all mind elaborating on some of that, particularly for some of the younger folks here? What was that experience, and how did that change perceptions of the Democratic Party?
Well, it probably didn't change much. I think that the 19 yeah, okay, I think that was the beginning of the watershed era, the period between 64 and 68. By the time the 68 convention came around, most of the young people who were conscious at that time had given up on the Democratic Party, and many veterans of the oppressive war in Vietnam were down in Miami, attacking the Republican convention. I mean, pitched battle wars that were going on. 1964, I thought the most important thing was, with regard to the Democratic Party, was, well, two things. One is that the lessons, a lot of people who were in Mississippi, for them, as I said before, the Revolutionary Act was registering to vote. And they really thought that many people thought that if you register to vote, that was a major step forward in what we used to call in CORE, free by 63. In fact, when I got involved with CORE in 61, the slogan for National Congress of Racial Equality was free by 63. And damn if I didn't believe that. Of course, I might have been a little bit naive at that point in my life, because that's 1963 and it's 2014, so maybe I might have to give that up. But the point I'm making is that there were people who believed in it. And they were profoundly disappointed when as Phil pointed out, the organized betrayal takes place. And there were people from Mississippi and from all over. There were a lot of students who had come south. There were a lot of SNCC workers who were participating in the whole process, who still believed that people were going to be seated. And what happened was, as Phil pointed out, is that the Democratic Party was told to allow 2 seats. And then the people from Mississippi and Mississippi Freedom Democratic Parties, Fannie Lane was the one that was most famously enunciated, I didn't come all the way up here to take no 2 seats. But that was one set of things that happened. Those people learned that lesson. At a national level, at least what I began to hear and grasp and a little bit understand, was that whatever your relationship was to the Democratic Party or any other, you got to organize independently. You got to build an independent constituency. You got to build an independent base. And that debate went on inside SNCC so much that it split SNCC. That you had to build an independent base. I do know that the reason that I came up to San Francisco State, there were 2 reasons. I was avoiding the war, avoiding going to prison, I'm sorry, because I wasn't going to war. And the other thing was, we made a bet. The bet was he was going to go back to Howard and organize a black students organization, mass-based black student organization at Howard University, and I ended up at San Francisco State. We both were going to do that, but our thing was, at that point, I think that Charlie Cobb was much less a person who was interested in nonviolence at that point than I was. But that wasn't his persona. But the reason that you go is that you have to build an independent base, because there's going to be a long struggle, and you have to build support bases for the struggles that were going to happen, as we talked about it in the black community. So one of the major reasons that I went to San Francisco State, and I went there for that purpose, to build a black student union. Well, I didn't know it was going to be called a black student union, but to build a black student movement on the campus, organization on the campus. But not to build a black student organization. Every teacher, every person who did yard work, every person who served food in the cafeteria was a member of the Black Student Union. So you build a horizontal organization that breaks exclusivity, involves all the sororities and the fraternities and gays and straights and whatever religious organization. Why? Because your purpose is to build a supply base for an ongoing, protracted, radical, I won't say revolutionary, radical movement in black communities, Latino communities, and in mass communities across the United States, in unity with anti-imperialist struggles around the world. So that's how far, I mean, between 64 and 68, you almost couldn't find people in SNCC who weren't taking some part of what I just laid out as a part of their natural dynamic. That's what people did in Lowndes County. Their thing was they were going to build an independent black organization called the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, whose symbol was the Black Panther. Right? And the Black Panther was supposed to be so heavy because the symbol of the white Democratic Party was the bantam cock, the bantam rooster, and that was the food for the panther. That's what we're talking about here. An independent black base. And that's a profound thing that one learns from that 64 Democratic Convention that organized betrayal by the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I want to stay on that just for one last second, I guess, maybe, on the 64 convention. Because what happened there, and I don't know, Jay did it real quickly, is that we went around to delegates at the convention, mostly from the West Coast, mostly from the North, the Northeast, got a tremendous amount of support that the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, would basically get recognized, and that the state racist Democratic Party from Mississippi would be told to go home. That happened up until Lyndon Johnson got nervous. And he thought about, well, he's still an unelected president, thanks to the assassination of Kennedy. His base is still the Dixiecrats from the South, his old racist buddies. And if he brought in their main opposition, Black Freedom Democrats, they would bolt the party. And he would possibly lose. And there would be, as far as he was considered, race war. So he decided that the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party could not win. And so he called in his big guns, Hubert Humphrey, who was a senator, liberal senator from Minnesota, who was being pushed by liberals and labor to be his vice president and hopefully a future president.
And Joseph Rao.
And Joseph Rao, who was the labor person who was basically the coordinator of, for a long time, the strategy of the MFDP in Atlantic City. Basically, when Johnson basically put out to the Humphrey folks and the folks around the liberals is that if Humphrey could not resolve this issue of the Mississippi Democrats, is he was not going to be vice president. So then the pressure goes off of from Humphrey and his liberals onto us and the civil rights people. And so we get all these people saying, you have to compromise. Politics is the art of compromise. And look, you came up here, you've gotten on TV, people know you, you've gotten a great deal of reception. hey, what else could you want? I mean, maybe later you'll get the actual recognition, but not this time. And so you had people from all the major civil rights organizations, the NAACP, Urban League. We had Martin Luther King come in and say, you should take this compromise. And by the way, as Jimmy said, the compromise was something they chose. But they didn't let us choose who our delegates would be to be chosen. They decided to choose who would be the delegates. One, a black person, Aaron Henry, and one, a white person, Reverend Ed King. Both good human beings and good people that were part of the delegation, but basically, again, from the top, they were saying who our representatives should be. And basically, we said no. One of our great heroes at that time, Byron Rustin, came in, and he also said, politics is the art of the possible. It is the art of compromise. We have to form a coalition with labor, liberals, what would be the left at that time, to basically be the next stage of the movement in this country. And at this moment, it had to be led by Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey. Take the compromise. And as Jimmy said, Fannie Lou Hamer and the other folks said, we didn't come all this way just for no 2 seats. We refused the compromise. Good. And we went back to Mississippi. So that's what happened there. But the thing I want to say was the significance of what happened there. Because you're talking about 1964, the Public Accommodations Law and the Voting Rights Laws had not yet passed. They would pass later in 64 and 65. You were at the very beginning of modern, what we call desegregation integration in the United States. It was just at the stage of happening. And to me, what was important about what happened there, and it's something that is still true today, is that the people who run the country symbolize who was going to get ahead in this country. Who was America for? And who was it not for? It was not going to be for poor people, poor black people, poor Latin people, people who were uneducated, people who were at the grassroots, didn't have anything officially to offer the country, and that if you were middle class, if you wore suits and ties, preferably if you were light-skinned, African American, you could possibly get accepted and move ahead. And that was not the kind of movement or country that we were trying to build. And I guess why I'm hitting on this point, because if you understand that, today you understand who were Oscar Grants, who were the Amadou Diallos in New York, who was Michael Brown in St. Louis, who are the people who are not making it in this society in the year 2014. And that basically line, a different kind of color class line, was set down first in a very public view in Atlantic City Democratic Convention in 1964. And that line still stands today.
I'll just add one other point about the Freedom Democratic Party. I think for those of us who were white and naive and not used to this kind of depth of understanding and organizing, I think it became a summer, I'll speak for myself anyway, of disillusionment. Every single system I was brought up to believe in was decimated that summer. Whether it was the schools, whether it was the police, whether it was government. I refused to be a Democrat after that. So I joined the Peace and Freedom Party, which I've been a member of ever since, even though it's a small socialist party with very little influence. I could not, in all due conscience, be a part of the systems that I had found were so corrupt. And I mean, even in terms of hospitals and doctors, and when Silas McGee got shot and we took him to the hospital, they would not let us in one door because it was the white side of the hospital. He had a bullet in his head The two guys that were driving the car had taken off their shirts to stop the blood. His head was in my lap, so I was all bloody. We walked up to the door. They wouldn't let us in. We had to go get in the car and go around this hospital to the other side. And even then, the sheriff and his men had gone to the other side and stood akimbo like this, blocking our entrance. Wouldn't let the guys get the stretcher because they had no shirts on and you couldn't get in the hospital without your shirt. And I'm looking at him and saying, the shirts are around his head. And they're just saying, sorry. So I had to go in and get the stretcher out and pull it in, and I could see nurses, doctors, all white, they had come across to the black side, blocking the way for the one black doctor in Greenwood who had been called by SNCC and was waiting to operate on him. And the few nurses, they wouldn't even let them in to get him through the door. So I brought him through the door, carrying the stretcher by two hands, dragging him across the threshold, dragging him through the first little hallway, and then the doctor and nurses picked him up. So that's another, there was not one system that I was taught was uncorrupted, democratic, and for the good of the people that I totally lost faith in. And that includes the democratic system.
Alright, so I have just one more question for the presenters, and then I will open it up to questions from the audience. And just to kind of bring this forward, Phil, you talked a little bit about it already, but just in today's, with Ferguson happening, with Oscar Grant, with Eric Garner, Michael Brown, we see these uprisings, these sparks all over the country beginning to arise. And I think that today there's a movement sort of developing. And so as veterans of civil rights, of lifelong organizers, what do you all see, and what kind of advice would you give today for those that are trying to engage in organizing around these issues of racial oppression, of capitalism, all the different types of issues that are ongoing right now? And so I just want to get your thoughts on that.
So, a couple of things come to mind. I think we have to think about how we look at the picture. And quick digression. The 60s period, and this is not totally true for everybody or all forces, but there was a kind of political logic at the time of the civil rights movement. And that was that the problem was a bunch of racist Southerners in the South. Klan people, White Citizens Council, Dixiecrat politicians. And what we needed to do was to bring in the government to basically get them to enforce their own constitution and basically take care of these Southern Dixiecrats. Problem, Dixiecrats, solution, government. And what we've seen in the years since that time is that was a very kind of facetious, very easy kind of syllogism politically. And I find this just from my own work around immigration issues, that the problem is the United States government, it's not the solution. And that many of us thought in the days when we were still young and still learning and open, is that if people just got enough information, if we just talked to the right people, and people would see the big picture, and they would be ready to go for change. If we could just lobby our Congress people, if we could just talk to the right officials, the right politicians, but we were looking to the government as for the solution. And increasingly, no matter where you look in the United States or around the world, the United States, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Ferguson, whether it's immigration, whether it's climate change, or as I would call it, the need for climate justice, the United States government is the problem.
Yeah.
And it's that slogan that came out of at least one of them that came out of the social forum, that for another world to be possible, another United States is necessary. And it is in some ways, in major ways, the responsibility of people who are activists in this country to begin to make that a possibility. And that we are talking about changing this government, we're talking about changing the institutions, and we're also talking about changing the thought patterns of how people have thought and conditioned and how they have experienced social phenomena in this country. So the second piece I just would say, starting from that, is that we have to realize that, and it's a slogan that has come up particularly out of the Black liberation struggle, stop the war against Black America.
Yes.
Or Black and Brown America, increasingly. But even a lot of our radical liberal friends think there's some problems in the Black community. There are certainly some things that we would be opposed to any human person, but they don't see this as a war going on. There is a war happening in urban communities, ghettos, barrios, whatever, in the United States. It has all the intensity of what was the war in Vietnam, the war in Iraq. It is a war. And as a front line, in terms of the United States, have been the military, have been the police forces, and their whole job has been to fight and in the African American communities, and increasingly now the Latino communities. And to the degree that our white radical political friends don't see that at the same level, that there is a war going on in this country already, that we're not going to be able to figure out some unified way of taking the next steps to actually changing this country and moving forward. The last piece I would say on that is going from the standpoint of the government as the problem, going from the point that there's a war in this country, in our own communities, against our own people, is that we have to see that the step is to have a broader imagination of what is possible in this country. And basically, a lot of our movements have been basically kind of left reform movements, fighting within the context. I mean, some of the ones I work with, Causa Justa, Just Cause, we do great work at the level of keeping people from getting evicted. But we're not talking about changing the housing situation, how people have to live in this country, what are the resources. That's the question, I think, of the 21st century. And there's nobody, I think, who better puts that out than this lady who's in the process of dying, Grace Lee Boggs, in Detroit, where she talks about that the problems and the solutions of the 21st century are not things that we talked about in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but we have to have a whole new paradigm, which starts with our own thinking of how we change the glass and what's possible. And so, but at the same time, I'm an African American, I am a person of color, and I have to work at the level of where we are, and that's the immediate war in the Black communities for freeing political prisoners, but even going beyond that in a way that talks about how do we change the prison system in this country. And that's a whole bigger picture.
I did want to address this a little bit. My life was a little bit different from Brother Phil's. When my family went to Los Angeles, people from everybody, from ministers and anybody else who were living in the Black community, South Central LA is where I moved to. They warned you. They say, look, there are three white gangs in Los Angeles. One was called the Spook Hunters, and that was around Washington High School out at Inglewood. The Spook Hunters. The second was the Los Angeles Police Department. And the third was the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. The Los Angeles Sheriff's Department took care of all the Mexicans. The Los Angeles Police Department took care of all the blacks. And the Spook Hunters dealt with the territoriality. So my upbringing was a little bit different in that when you hit town, you know who the immediate enemy is. And you have to come to grips with that on an everyday basis. So far as I'm concerned, that stream of having to confront that issue manifests itself with the Black Panther Party. It manifests itself with various brown and black community organizations all over this country. They've always had to confront that day-to-day reality. It hasn't changed. It may have expanded, it may have deepened. As I say, the optics was, as both Linda and Phil pointed out, was about these cracker racists in the South. The fact is that that's been made a national program. I remember that Bob Moses used to say that we have to come to grips with the fact that the only program for black youth was a program of violence, and you have to be able to, and the country's job was first to put that program out and then to direct that violence either against defined external enemies, enemies that are defined by the American nation, or against themselves. And I think that's been updated to a national program of self-destruction, where the issue is that we will not, if we're young black males, we're not gonna make it to be 21. So let us do our immediate gratification. That is a taught, a learned process that is imposed every day by the American nation. It is not only imposed in this country, it's imposed all over the world. So that young Latinos who came up here from Guatemala, many of whom were part of the revolutionary movement in Guatemala and El Salvador, by the time they were driven out of here, and Vietnam too, because that's where I have a home in Vietnam, and I'm there 4 or 5 months a year. Same thing happens. Young people have been driven to incredible alienation. Alienated not only against that system, but alienated against their own families. Yes. Alienated against their own lives. And so right now, where I live at 814 59th Street, I don't know if you've heard of that, but that's walking distance from here. It's right across the street from the old Merritt College, and it's 100 yards from where the first Black Panther Party office was opened. I live in a community that is being gentrified and redefined. The community that I grew up, I spent the last 13 years in, it is now called North Oakland and Berkeley. I'm sorry, Emeryville. What is it called? North? Nobi. Yeah, Nobi. North. I mean, hey, or San, or I mean. First, they controlled it, as they did when they landed with Christopher Columbus. And then they redefined it. They renamed it. They renamed it after a bankrupt Italian, Americo Vespucci. They will name it almost anything so that it changes the name. Every community, Thomas Scow, all these communities are being named. And what happens is that as a young blacks are different from when I was growing up in high school and I was in the street gang. There was a defined group of people who were told by the street gang leaders, the Buchanan brothers, said, Jimmy, you have to go to class because you're smart. That is, they defined internally where you should go. Now, in this culture, the definition is break from school. Well, why stay in school? The reason would be that there's some life force in that institution that would justify your presence. Unless we really come to grips with that question, we're going to end up with not only the crimes that are being committed by the state apparatus and the police. The Malcolm X grassroots movement did a very good thing saying that young black males are being killed, every 28 hours? Yeah. But that's part of a program. That's part of a program. The prisons are filled with people who are being destroyed every day. A body of work that it seems to me would have to be engaged in by whoever is calling themselves revolutionary, is how do you come to grips with transforming that sector of the community? Because that has always historically been the most revolutionary sector. Young people, that's what SNCC was. Young people younger than we were more brave than we were. So how do you come to grips with that? How do you merge this displacement process that's happening in Oakland, who are by whites who are being displaced by the millionaires in San Francisco? How do you come to grips with that? To me, those are the ways that we have to start, or maybe somebody's already solved that problem, but that's what Ferguson is. Last thing I'll say, Ferguson doesn't begin in 2014.
That's right.
In 1968, after the Kerner Commission report, what was promoted was white people had a disease called racism, and they talked about the disease. But as a part of that book, they talked about triage. That is, you had to restructure urban life in America to diffuse this racism that white people had. And part of that was three things. One was spatial deconcentration, that is flushing all these blacks out. I just read an article today about Harlem being 40% black.
Yep.
Washington, D.C., I think is 45 or maybe 45% black. Well, you flush them out. And then what you do is you structure regional governments around urban areas so that, like Detroit, which is bankrupt, the fourth or fifth richest communities in this country surround Detroit. So you have a situation in Ferguson where they put together about 20 separate and distinct communities. 4 or 5 of them are majority black within that county. But the dominant forces, they structure around the immediate credentialing of whites to link them together so that they would protect the madness which becomes Ferguson. And then we become upset about it. We say, all these police who have all these mechanized weapons and all this and that and the other, please understand that black people have been experiencing that from day one. The mechanized, we are the people who have where the training and development and the decision on which mechanized weapons would be used, that's where they tested out. That's what that black war on drugs was from the beginning. Let's test it out. Let's give the drugs to them. Let's transfer the drugs to them. Then let's put them in a place, warehouse them, because we don't have any, there's not enough jobs, etc. Those are the kinds of things that seem to me to reflect on Ferguson. Ferguson is good. It opens up the wound so that other people can see it. But I'm telling you, there are people in this country who saw it as no surprise. On my own block, which used to be 85% black, and is now 15% black families. 2 times I've been stopped by the police for walking, and I'm 72 goddamn years old. But somebody thought that because I wasn't dressed I didn't look homeless, I wasn't picking up cans and bottles off the street, which is what's left of our community. They thought, well, maybe he's casing the neighborhood in order to burglarize it. And if it had not been for a Berkeley female cop, I'd be dead now. Because the Oakland cops came down. They swooped hard. They didn't their thing was, here he is. We got us, and the woman came down the street and said, that's him. You know where she came from? She was visiting for the weekend. She saw what she saw, just as the crazy people in the Walmart saw what they saw. Now, I'm not trying to make you feel guilty about it. What I'm saying is that if you're going to define yourself as a revolutionary grouping or a radical grouping, you're going to have to come to grips with that kind of reality. And if you fail to do that, then you're not only trying to fool yourself, you end up fooling the people in the thinking that you don't have to do that because you already have the way.
I think the original question was, how does Ferguson ring true today and what are the lessons to bring to it? It's a little hard to add to what they said, but I'm going to just break it down as somebody who's in the school with the youth, and it's almost I am one of those 60s folks you talked about that will never come out of the 60s. But that's because I found my mission in the 60s. Not missionary, but mission. That's a different one. But I think for youth, they know Ferguson. Ferguson is Oakland. Ferguson is Berkeley. Ferguson is, like you said, it's every city, it's every block. And I know all the institutions are corrupted, but I still in my heart believe in education, and that I believe in truth and authentic education. And for me, for students to build their knowledge base, and I'm just going to teach very bluntly because I work with new teachers coming into Oakland, most of whom are white, most of whom are not from this area. And it bothers me that most come in with a deficit model of education. And I don't mean that testing and all the crap that's in the school, that's what's deficit in the school. The students are not deficit. And when teachers really grab a hold of the depth and breadth that students have in them and can go to, that's when the real education happens. That's when that light you talked about, why go to school if there's no light there, if there's no joy there? To me, that is on the individual teacher. When the door is closed, that is the teacher's haven. You don't have to teach to the test if you've got some guts about you. You don't have to teach the test if you've got some grit about you. You don't have to teach what anyone is telling you to teach if you have some guts and some organizing behind you. That means unions. That means teachers building cohorts with each other that can stand up and say, we want relevant, meaningful lessons in our classroom. We're going to do it. These students that we have in Oakland and Berkeley are so rich, but that gold in there is not being tapped. So I still believe it can be tapped. We see it tapped a lot, sometimes by accident, sometimes intentionally. I believe that teachers, that young group, 20 and 30 something, can make headways there. I also think we have to have a vision. You need to see what is the society you would like to look at. What does it look like? If you don't have that goal in your mind, then it's going to be very hard to keep pushing forward. The vision of whatever your vision is, pluralistic, equal. Everyone's going to have to come to grip with their own prejudices, their own biases. Folks coming into this country are going to have to dig deep and learn some history, because when I hear we're all immigrants, I just like, really? Tell that to the African American. Right. He was extracted from his homeland. Tell that to the Native Americans that came over thousands of years ago. Know the history and the oppression that's here. If teaching oppression, teach resistance. They are trying to wipe out all resistance movements from the history books now. There are little big picture, small picture. Fight for truth and reality and fact in the curriculums. Not anti-science, not anti-fact. Truth. And students will grab a hold of it, and students will run with it. Now, what they need from there, I think, is following that money and the threads of the connection. Because you talk about the Deacons for Defense, or the folks that had our backs down in Greenwood or in Mississippi that I didn't know had our backs, that you didn't know had our backs. But in truth, if you don't have some lawyers, if you don't have some connection, don't just get out there just because of anger. Get out there, because you know if you're protesting, someone's going to be down there with the bail. Because we, especially folks of color, can get their butts put behind jail, lock the door, and forget about them. So it's got to be smart thinking. But is that piece of the pie? This is where I don't want to sound like Obama, because I'm not Obama. But on some level, I think we teachers and we in our own worlds have to understand how we have fed this me first, me only, and me culture that we have now. Because when good times, was it good times? Get a piece of the pie. I used to look at my students and say, well, what's so good about the pie? What's in that pie that you want a piece of? It might be the pie is worth throwing out and starting all over again, which is that vision. What do we want? Make coalitions. Is environment your issue? Connect with the civil rights. If women's issues are your issue, connect with the gays. If the gay LGBT is your issue, connect with the environment. Connect, and build, and know what you're getting into, and know where you want to go.
All right, so I just want to open it up for some questions before we leave. All right, so I have you over there.
Yes. What's frustrating about hearing these profound stories is that I've learned more here than from any PBS documentary about Freedom Summer. We hear about the Holocaust in one or another form of our media somewhere in this country every day. You think the United States perpetrated the Holocaust, but the Holocaust that the United States has perpetrated, we rarely hear about it, or we hear about it in these watered down forms like some Ken Burns festival. Documentary, I should say. I hope you guys are part of the FSM, since you guys inspired a lot of the people in the FSM, and you know they're having their 50th anniversary thing at UC Berkeley. My question is that I'm not a pacifist. I believe in violence or armed struggle where that is necessary. I don't believe in it where and when it is not necessary. You know, the issue of Occupy came up here, and I wrote a documentary appearing at David D's website called The Activism Entry Point. Actually, it's all over the web, and if anyone just Googles the Activism Entry Point, you'll be able to find it about the issue of violence. The problem that I had about violence in Occupy Oakland is that it wasn't principled, it wasn't disciplined, it wasn't organized, and it wasn't immediately intelligible or readily intelligible by the masses of people in the East Bay. The most successful actions that occurred in Occupy Oakland were nonviolent actions, especially the 2 port shutdowns, where 50,000 people on one shutdown, and at a minimum 30,000 people at another shutdown, shut down the port, costing the capitalists millions of dollars per day. At the end of those, and on other days, there were people who called themselves Black Bloc or called themselves anarchists, I don't know what they necessarily were, would do the de rigueur things of turning over dumpsters and setting them on fire, indiscriminately smashing cafe windows in downtown.
Can we get to the question? I'm sorry.
In downtown
We want other people to speak as well, so I'm sorry.
In downtown Oakland, scaring immigrant Chinese to death in Oakland, Chinatown. And so I'm wondering what you all have to say about the forms of violence and armed struggle. Like, I support the Palestinian armed struggle. You very rarely hear anyone on the left say that. But this kind of overturning dumpsters, smashing windows, and that kind of stuff. I'm wondering what you have to say, all of you have to say about that. Oh, and at the end of this entry point, I have a dialogue with Boots in the comments section.
Well, I'll try to be brief. I agree with the thrust in terms of your analysis of Occupy Oakland. by far the most successful stuff they did was the ports, and that also the groups that were doing the violence or extra legal work were basically not very well organized, and they actually compromised the safety of some of the other people in the marches. But at the same time, I'd say that I think there's a role for all forms of struggle, and that I think that's all I want to say in a public meeting on this.
What about when it alienates?
Next person.
All right. So I want another question. Please keep it brief. We want to get to as many people as possible. I will cut you off if it's a long speech.
Would Jimmy like to answer this question?
Okay.
Would you, Jimmy?
No, let's,
I'm gonna leave it alone. It'll come around, believe me, it'll come around.
Okay.
I don't bite my tongue very well.
The most interesting thing I heard today, the most relevant, is I think what you said, James, building an independent base. And you know, because if you don't build an independent base, your political goals will fall because people won't stay together for the low periods. You know, you have to build an independent base for the long haul, and which is across the street. Anyway, a lot of that is cooperative mutual aid, people just helping each other. And from that comes two questions. What was going on among the local people in Mississippi in '64 that was dealing with mutual aid? I know there were the freedom schools and other things. And what kind of cooperative mutual aid would you recommend for today?
First of all, I think those are two very good points, very salient points. And I am going to get back to Brother's point, because I'm one of those people I'm an attorney also, and I was called on to bring young blacks out of jail because they were following around with guys who were breaking laws, and the police were arresting them. And if they were, a lot of times when they were white, they got overnight, and then if they were black, the young black kids, some of them are still in jail.
There you go.
But with regard to your first, the points about building independent movements and the issue about cooperatives and how to build that. My own view is that was an important time for us, as all over this country, there were people building various groups.